I'm a marketing strategist, researcher, and leader. And I'm joined by some really amazing and knowledgeable women here who I'll introduce in just a second. But before we get started, Steve would like to thank you for putting together this amazing event that's taken place this week. I think by any account, it's been a tremendous success and certainly a much needed bit of inspiration to all of us during some very challenging times. And like, I'm going to join the ranks of many of the speakers this week and give a shout out to all the caregivers and all the folks who are out there in the trenches who've been, sort of battling this on a day-to-day basis. My mother lives in senior housing in Cincinnati, and I just feel incredibly blessed by the care that she's received and just the genuine love and concern and the safety that everyone there has provided. So anyway, a shout out to all you guys and a shout out to you, Steve, for making all this happen. Again, I'm Marianne Donaghy. I am a career marketer who has consistently used market research throughout my 30+ year career to inform both marketing and business decisions, and have found that data and market research really helps an organization gain alignment and to face particularly big challenges and opportunities. So it just kind of is very, very powerful and persuasive to inform action. So I'm a marketing consultant focusing on strategy and research, and joining me today are Allison Fergal, who is an organizational psychologist and professor at the University of North Carolina Kenan Flagler School of Business. I could talk to Allison all day. She's full of incredible wisdom, and you're going to be really excited by what she has to say today. And Allison's going to provide a lot of perspective on what I call the whys behind the whats. So, data is great, but what's really important to inform sort of your action is, why is this happening? So Allison's going to bring a lot of value to that conversation. And also joining us is Denise Boudreau-Scott, who is president of Drive. And Drive focuses on developing positive cultures, particularly in senior housing, focus on senior housing. And hopefully many of you had the opportunity to see her speak yesterday. It was a great presentation, Denise. So Thank you so much for all your energy and your passion around the idea of culture and building positive cultures in our sector. So I'm going to give you a little background, but first I want to just share, our title here today is called Work Experience Survey 2020, the good, the bad, and the opportunity. And that title is based on the fact that we're going to hear some things today that we're going to feel good about. We're going to hear some things that we feel not so good about, but really the focus is on what can we learn from this data? How can we turn this data into actionable opportunities? How can we turn around some of our workplaces and our cultures as a result of this insight? And I'm gonna move this. Sorry, I'm gonna move around our. Oops. I've got our faces here overlooking my slide. This research was conducted as part of Empower Women in Senior Living. And this is a group that Steve Moran developed back in the summer of last year. And the idea was around, there really is a lack of, I guess, grassroots support to help women in senior housing, to provide them the support to maximize their careers, to move their careers forward so they can contribute as best as possible to both their organizations and to the industry overall. So he recruited an advisory board of about 30 senior living executives and consultants. I am on that advisory board, as is Denise. And we have just a great group of folks who got together twice in, I guess, in the third quarter of last year. And we talked about, what do we want our mission to be? What will be our vision? And then how do we bring this vision to life? And we landed on 3 pillars: mentorship, education, and awareness. So we recognize that mentorship is really, really important for women to mentor and support each other and guide each other through their careers. that there's an opportunity to have focused education to help provide more education to women in certain areas of the sector. And then awareness, awareness of what are the differences between how men and women behave and work, how they communicate, and how that impacts the workplace. But what we were a little challenged on is, what are our priorities? We had some differing opinions on what we should prioritize in terms of our programming, and decided to conduct this research to give us the insights that we needed to move forward. So with that, I'm going to jump in, and please, I would encourage you to, if you see some data that seems surprising or particularly interesting, please put it into the chat box, and Denise and Steve, if you can call some of these out. But please encourage you to ask some questions, and we'll answer them as we go, and then address some of them towards the end. All right, so first of all, who responded? We had 775 responses, which really far exceeded our expectations of respondents. Over 80% were female, just slightly over. And it's important to note here that we wanted, through this research, to understand the differences on how men and women are, not just about how women are experiencing the workplace, but the differences between how men and women are experiencing the workplace. So we did, out of the 775, that gives us, about 150 male respondents, which gives us a great ability to compare and contrast. All right, one of the things that's really important and interesting is that of these 775 responses, these were very tenured folks. So 80% have over 16 years of work experience. 69% are directors and above. And I will note that with men, they had a higher level of C-suite that participated. But as we think about how people responded and the way the questions were asked, this is, you get an idea of, these are folks who have experienced quite a bit. They've been around for a while. They're not newbies to the industry or to the workplace. 87% of the respondents work exclusively or partially in senior living, and I was able to sort of compare those, the experiences or the responses for those working in senior living versus those who work in other sectors. The majority of the respondents worked for operators, either at the headquarters or at the corporate level. Almost a third were working for service providers. And we had three key findings that we're really going to focus on today. And there are lots of really interesting things that came out of this, and I'm happy to field any questions about it and drill down a little bit more. But there are really three critical findings. One is that we are not tapping into the unique skills, experience, and perspective of our employees. We'll see this through a whole suite of questions, and I know Allison's going to provide a lot of insight on that, and I think Denise will as well. But this reality was supported in a whole range of questions that we asked. Number two, bullying exists in our companies, not just on the playground. This is probably going to be a little bit controversial when you see the results, but again, we're focusing on opportunities and moving forward and resolving some of the issues that exist to get to solutions. And number three, to improve the sector, community level leadership, more so than headquarter leadership, meaning training, mentorship, and employee retention are viewed as the most important things that the sector can do to improve. All right, so I'm going to start with one of the things that was really interesting is that age bias was actually a bigger issue to folks in terms of what was holding them back in their career than gender bias. We, I think, would have expected gender bias to be more significant. And this is obviously with both men and women. we asked some questions about family to just get a sense of whether folks with children were having some different issues than folks without children. So I will say overall, when I sort of sliced and diced the data, I did not see a difference, much of a difference in terms of how people responded that had children versus those who did not have children. Probably these first three are not a big surprise to anyone, that women are much more likely to have taken time off, whether it was 3 months or years off, or to have felt at a disadvantage for having children. I was a little bit surprised by only 22% of women or sort of respondents taking 3 months off, given that the majority of our respondents are female and the vast majority had children. So I'm you know, it depends on, I suppose, the policies of the organization. Maybe 6 weeks is more of the standard. Interestingly, men were more likely than women to say that they made a career decision to prioritize family or children. Now, that could mean that they chose a promotion or chose a job that required relocation. So that may be driving that. But what was really interesting to me was that more men than women had said no to a big project or a work trip that would require missing an important personal or family event. I think probably both Allison and Denise can provide some color commentary here, but you know, I think I don't think anyone would guess that women are any less committed to their families than men. So, you know, certainly worth considering that perhaps men feel that they are in a more stable position in their roles or in their companies and feel more comfortable saying no than women do. So would love Denise and Allison for you to contemplate that as we kind of go through the comments. Across the board, as I said earlier in terms of our key findings, that both men and women really feel undervalued and underleveraged in their organizations. And you can see there's some categories where the view of men and women is pretty consistent or pretty even. But this whole idea around bosses who don't appreciate their value as why they haven't reached their full career potential. Men, I'm going to point out here that men felt more consistently treated fairly and given advancement opportunities than women have by almost 10 percentage points. So that's something to certainly consider. But two things that I've circled here I think are really interesting because there are big gaps between how men and women responded. And women were more than twice as likely to say that they felt ignored or overlooked in meetings. That's a pretty staggering difference, and I think we really need to understand what's going on there. And women were also much more likely to say that they felt their skills and capabilities were not appreciated or fully leveraged. All right, so here's the big one, this workplace bullying. Women were more likely overall to feel that they had been bullied across the board. And both women and men were more likely to feel that they had been bullied by a female coworker than a male coworker. You can see the data, it's pretty significant. So 10 percentage points difference in women saying that they were bullied by a female coworker than bullied by a male coworker. One of the things that was really interesting as I looked at the cuts of the data and I looked at tenure, those who had less than 5 years of tenure were far likely to feel that they had been bullied by a man. So only 10%. So you can see here, you know, the 24%, 17% bullied by a male coworker, whereas those with 5 years of tenure or less was only 10%. But 43% in that same group felt that they had been bullied by a female coworker. The manager and director level respondents were most likely to say they've been bullied when we looked at it from a level standpoint. And the difference between being felt like that they were being bullied by a female versus a male was 15 percentage points. So a bigger gap than the 44-33% we're seeing here. And the other thing, when I looked at the cuts of how do people respond to this question who were inside senior living versus outside senior living, and in this case, those who work outside senior living were more likely to have, or as likely to be to feel bullied by a female than by a male. So another interesting aspect of what's happening in senior living to be explored by our experts here. So with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to Allison to provide her perspective, given her expertise and role.
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Allison Fergale. I'm an organizational psychologist and a professor, and women's advocacy is an area of specialty for mine that I speak about quite a bit. So when I was fortunate to be brought in here and Marianne showed me these results, particularly the results on gender, they weren't surprising to me. They have predictable, understandable psychological explanations. And so that's what I'm just going to talk about for a few minutes, is what's the psychology that could explain, particularly the findings we just discussed, where we see differences in bullying, differences in perspective of feeling listened to, overlooked, and even the one about saying no to responsibilities or saying no to a work event for a family event, where men were more likely to do that than women. So there's two things that generally explain any gender difference that we see like this. One is how women behave differently than men, which is what I'll talk about now. And the other is holding behavior constant, how women are perceived differently than men. And both of those are true. I can't tell for any given survey result here what combination of those two is driving it. But in general, we find both are true. So women behave differently than men. Particularly in the context of anything that's considered advocating for one's self-interest. So anytime I have to speak up to advocate for something for which I would be the beneficiary, that we see gender differences in behavior due to what we call stereotype conflict, which is that we have stereotypes that we all hold, either consciously or not, about how men and women should behave. And those are listed there, with the male stereotype being more independent, assertive, self-reliant, powerful, and the female stereotype more communal, caring, helpful, and giving. The challenges that when we are in a role where we have to speak up, advocate for ourselves, present an idea, say what we need. For women, that presents what we call a stereotype conflict. Because to be a good advocate is to do those things on the left, right? To be independent and assertive and forceful. Here's what I need. But to be a good woman is to do the things on the right, to be caring and nurturing. So it creates a mental conflict for women that doesn't exist for men, because to be what you are expected to be as a man and to be what you're expected to be as an advocate for yourself are actually the same things. They're the same on the left. Whereas for women, there's an inconsistency. And that is, in psychological terms, what we think about as a stereotype conflict. I am trying to uphold two different expectations of what I'm supposed to be, and I can't do them both at once. And that tension is part of a long list, history of research that says it leads women to be less willing to step up to the plate and advocate for themselves. So if we look at the finding, like saying no to a work trip for a family event, when Marianne and I were talking about those results, and Denise as well, I said, that's a form of self-advocacy, right? To say I can't go because I have something else going on. And that's speaking up for what's good for me. And so men have an easier time doing it than women. So what was originally surprising, I said, no, when you understand the psychology of stereotype conflict, no, it's easier for men to do that than it is for women. So it's not about I'm not committed to my family. It's I'm going to suffer and go anyway because I can't speak up and advocate for myself. If we go to the next slide here, this one. Okay, so then we'll go through the piece on the left first. If women behave the same way as men behave, then we also have a difference in perception, which is I also mentioned. And two particular differences in perception that we see in science and problematic. So back to the idea of being overlooked. There's some great research that looked at speaking up in meetings with proactive ideas. And they had a protagonist who spoke up with an idea in a meeting that would help the organization. And all they did was vary whether the person speaking up was Eric or Erica, to obviously connote in people's minds, male or female. And they found that the act of speaking up with a good idea for the organization made Eric seem like he was more leader-like, but did nothing to improve the impressions of Erica as a leader. So this idea of feeling overlooked can be partially be, I do not advocate for myself. And it can also be driven by, when I do, I am not heard in the same way as male colleagues. Also, another difference we see is being more disliked for the same behavior. And I'll talk about this in a second, but so a great kind of experiment that was done a ways back on a business case with a female protagonist named Heidi Roizen, a real person. And students reacted very negatively to this woman because she was seen as being so strategic and so social climbing and power hungry. And one of the professors teaching the case said, you guys just think that because she's female. And the students said, no, we don't. So the next year, with her permission, he rewrote the case. This is one of the most brilliant pedagogical interventions I've ever seen. He rewrote the case, and he gave one section the case, as it always was, Heidi, and the other section got the absolute identical case, except he just changed the name Heidi to Howard. And it was a case about somebody who was very strategic in managing their social capital and their networks, and then at the end gave them a survey, and what do you think about this person? And Howard was a genius, and Heidi was a user. And so we have a lot of great experimental evidence that shows when we control behavior, and we say the exact same behavior is exhibited by men and women, it's perceived very, very differently. So both of these are true. Women act differently than men, women perceive differently than men.
Can I ask a question? Just
yeah, Denise.
In the, I wish it was mine because it's a great question, but it's from my friend Kendall. And he asked, is there any variance? Have you ever looked in different ethnic groups?
In terms of how these, some of these different same challenges?
Yeah, like I think the question, and Kendall, correct me if I'm wrong, but would there be a difference, might there be a difference in different ethnic groups between these challenges for women, the way that they're perceived, and when the same information is shared as a male shares it?
Yeah, so there are a variety of different findings, but the answer is, so if the question, for example, is like, are all women, or are women of different ethnicities or races experience these things even differently? Is that the question?
I'm thinking he might be asking, might there be if you went to, for example, a different country, or I know he does a lot of work with the Native American population, might there be differences in those groups? That's what I think it is, Kendall. Once again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Stereotype profiling.
I'm sorry.
Right. So
okay, I got that wrong.
So I think I understand the question. So any time an individual experiences an internal conflict between how they want to be and how they think the world expects them to be, that does create the I'm not sure how I'm supposed to behave problem that we had on the past, right? Okay. So that can happen with a variety of different. It could happen based on anything: sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, anything like that. Anytime there's a conflict between, like, I'm supposed to do one thing, but the world expects me to be another way, that can emerge. On these kind of challenges, on how people are perceived, we can see the similar kinds of things as well, right? Who speaks and who gets heard. And so it's not just women who are less likely to be heard and valued when they speak up, right? We can see that in the case of applying to pretty much every underrepresented minority that's been studied.
Okay.
Now, okay, so there was some comments I was coming in the chat, kind of like, this is true but depressing. I know, bad news. Okay, so let me talk about a couple thoughts on strategies for individuals and also strategies for organizations. So. And I say for women and for men, one, because these are things that everybody should be doing. They're just best practice. And two, there are things that men can and should do to be advocates for women. And I don't, back to the question about ethnicity, I could substitute that phrase for dominant group to minority group in any category, which is that we do not improve the circumstances of any minority group just through the actions of the minority group alone. The majority has to get involved They have to be part of the conversation. They have to do something about it. So with women, that would be men, right? But we could substitute in there any other set of groups. One is in terms of how to speak up. One of the things that's really effective for men and women, but particularly women, is in every given ask, take the time to explain how what you're advocating for actually in some way, shape, or form is to the benefit of others or to the organization. So even in something like something that feels very much self-interested, like compensation negotiation. So I tell the story of Sheryl Sandberg saying when she was negotiating with Mark Zuckerberg for Facebook and for salary at Facebook, and she said as she was negotiating with him, this is the only time you and I are ever going to be on opposite sides of the table. And I said, that's a brilliant statement, because what it's very subtly saying is, I care about you. I'm going to work really hard for you, and I am going to always be on your side, right? And every time we say the message, those things, those are really effective strategies for men and women, but particularly for women, because what we find is it's not the presence of assertive behavior that hurts women. It is the absence of the communal behavior. So I always tell women, be assertive, but just with that communal twist on the same message. Women are extremely good advocates for other people, right? It's and so we know it's not a skill issue. When you send women out to advocate and the beneficiary is someone else, they outperform men. Well, one takeaway from that is we should all be advocating for each other. I see in the comments here about women advocating for other women, right? We should step up, and the more we step up for other people, the more people naturally will step up for us. So become another advocate, become another promoter. That helps. I'll go down to the organizations piece. I want to be sensitive to time. We can talk about other stuff later. The question, are women more likely to be bullies, or women more likely to be perceived as bullies? And there's some evidence that says both could be true. We do know that insecurity about one's status, one's power, or one's competence does lead to more aggressive and hostile bullying types of behavior. So to the extent that women feel, rightly or wrongly, more insecure about their standing, it would suggest that we might see more bullying behavior. We also perceive people who lack status but have control over anything as being more likely to be bullies. This is actually some of my own work, is that we see the identical action as more of a bullying behavior when it comes from someone who lacks status, and women do lack status relative to men. So one thing I'll say now, and then I'll take more questions or move on and see if there's time for them later, is one of the things we should be doing as organizations is we need to be talking up our leaders, both to them and to others. When you talk up leaders to them, right? When you praise them, when you make them feel more secure. I'm doing the right thing. And secure leaders are not bullies, right? So when we are not providing enough feedback, enough praise, we are igniting insecurity, and we are growing a culture of bullying. The other thing is you got to talk up leaders to everyone around them, meaning that if I see you as a high status, highly competent, the best person for this job, because when you came in as a newcomer, everyone told me, right, how great you were, how talented you were, how impressive your resume was, you will come in with status in my eyes. And if I think highly of you, I will not interpret your behavior through the lens of a bully. And I think this is one of the things that we don't do in organizations as much as possible. It's fairly easy, it's costless, and we should basically be offering that sincere praise because it's bolstering everyone's sense of status. And when we bolster status, we see a lot less bullying and incivility. So.
I love, oh, sorry, Marianne, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, just this whole idea as, I think what I'm hearing you say, it's an unfortunate reality that women come into the organization, they don't have that sort of de facto level of kind of credibility or respect that a man does. And so there's a need to sort of talk up their credentials and capabilities of women more so than men. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think we should be doing it for everybody, because insecure male bosses aren't going to, insecurity is not attractive on a leader in any way, shape, or form. But particularly for women who may themselves, right, not be more insecure about their status for good reason. Yeah. And that we don't naturally look to a female leader as a high status individual. There's this great study that came out of the UK where a professor had a bunch of non-English speaking students. So she gave them a drawing project, since they couldn't, it was hard to communicate in English. And she said, draw leaders. And they all drew men. She didn't say draw men, she said draw leaders, but they were men. So our image of a leader is a man. when the woman comes in, right, there's a status gap in the eyes of the audience. Those of us that have brought that leader in, yes, should take greater efforts. But again, there's no reason we shouldn't be doing that for our men and our women, but that's why.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting that's not in the slides was that one of the questions was, what are the things that have held you back in your career? And men were more likely to say lack of assertiveness than women, which, you know, in theory would not be the case, but they felt maybe whether the expectation of them to be more assertive existed, or, you know, it just wasn't part of their, you know, approach to their work.
Yeah, and it could be, I mean, it's a different version of that stereotype conflict.
Yes.
Men are expected to be assertive, independent, forceful. And if that is not your style as a male leader, you might think that holds you back because you don't fit the expectation of what someone thinks they're going to get. And anytime that happens in the audience's mind, there's a bit of a negative reaction to that.
Yeah. Allison, when we were talking on the phone, prepping for this, one of the ideas that you shared was this idea of incivility in the workplace. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so incivility, I've done some work on this. It wasn't my original area of expertise. I got into it through the area of power and status. Basically, incivility is described as low-level deviant behavior of ambiguous intent, right? It's not the overt hostility and aggression. It's the eye rolls, the ignoring, the not being as responsive on work as you could be. The things where you think, you're not really respecting me, but it's subtle enough that there's another alternative explanation, and it exists at a fairly low level. And those, what we see is, although aggression, hostility, bullying are more extreme versions that are problematic, that low-level incivility is very rampant, right? Between 50 and 100% of people, when you ask them, will say they experience that at work. And we know that incivility tends to escalate in a tit-for-tat manner. And so incivility is basically the start of all severe hostility or bullying that we see in the workplace. Generally starts with that kind of lower level of disrespect. And so that's one of the things that, and I know Denise talked about culture, to think about getting a handle on, right? It's not just the overt hostility that we have to understand. It's the more subtle version as well.
Yeah, and Denise, I'd definitely like you to talk about that when we get to your slides here in a minute. But would you mind sharing the story that you had about sort of this bullying situation, Denise, about the...
Yeah. And, you know, I was going to make a comment. I wanted to make a comment a little bit earlier, too. Excuse me, that this low status power holders are more likely to see them as bullies. I see that all the time. You know, if a nursing assistant speaks up, if a dietary aide speaks up, it's kind of either people will outright say they're a bully, and sometimes people are actually exhibiting bullying behaviors, but sometimes they're advocating for themselves and their position and their role. Or subconsciously, sort of these little messages get sent out to people that they're being treated as bullies for speaking up. And so I think that's really interesting that you made that point, because I see that come up all the time. The story that I had shared with Marianne and Allison getting ready for this presentation is a true story from an organization that we're working with, and we were doing some focus groups on the night shift. And this woman had not gotten her certification yet, was a new nursing assistant, and came to work, once again, not certified yet. So she's brand new at all this, comes to work on the night shift. The supervisor introduces her to the person who's supposed to orientate her and show her around. And the person looked at her and said, I don't have time for you. I'm not doing that. And I'm not going to show you around. And the CNA, their nursing assistant, she wasn't as certified yet, said, oh, that's okay. I'll figure things out on my own. And basically showed herself around and how to do the job. And afterwards, after she told us the story, she said, I think I'm really just going to go back and work at Burger King. And for a field that is trying so hard, at least this organization was, to bring people in, they have a training program to train them and so forth, trying so hard, investing in these people to bring them on board, get them certified, and to have that feeling of getting immediately, when she showed up at work, within the first 5 minutes, treated like that, was just incredible. And so that, by the way, is not a rare story. I wish it was. I wish it was like, I can't believe I heard it. I've never heard things like that. That is a very common story. And we see it's time and time again, the bullying piece showing up.
What was the comment, something about eating your young?
Yes, and with pride that we hear this from nurses all the time. And for some reason, nurses, sometimes other people, like it's just the culture here is we eat our young, and then they laugh. Or I have nurses say it more than anyone about, you know, if you're a nurse, that's kind of just what we do. We eat our young, and it's not acceptable. And I tell them that. I say, I don't think that's funny. I don't think that's something to laugh about. You know, how did that feel when you were treated like that coming on into the organization? But it's this sense of, physicians do this a lot too. It's funny that in caring physicians we're doing this, but physicians do this a lot too. Like, I survived my residency and I got through it, and we shall beat you up too and hope you survive.
Yeah. And that's when you look at the levels, when you look at the bullying question and you look at the levels, I mean, there's nobody that's not been bullied. I mean, it's at every level. People have experienced it. You know, it goes, you know, sort of up and down, you know, slightly lower at the very top at the C-suite level, slightly lower at VP, and, you know, but directors and managers were, you know, the highest categories. So it's nobody's gotten out unscathed. But, you know, the key is, you know, as we look at what we're trying to do with Empower and with the organization or with the industry, is really focus on how do we tap into all the unique skills and experience and perspectives and approaches of both men and women, identify where the differences are, close that gap of understanding, so that at the end of the day, every organization comes out ahead, the whole industry comes out ahead, because everyone's, you know, full talent suite is being tapped into. Should I jump into the next slide, or are we okay? And then Allison, continue to keep jumping in if we've missed anything. If we
want to take one question, Joe Soto just asked, does additional pay for the trainer make a difference? It does not. And this is my experience, and Allison, you might have the research piece of this, but it does not. You know what I've seen make a difference, Joe, is when the trainer is respected and valued. And let's say Marianne and Allison work with me, and Allison's a new employee, and I say, hey, Marianne, guess what? Allison's starting next week. She's coming in on Monday. Brand new nursing assistant. So I know the last person that just started had worked in our field for like 20 years. You just kind of had to show them around and show them the ropes. But Allison's going to need a little support because she's truly brand new to all of this. But I picked you, Marianne, because I know how patient you are with people. I see you all the time with the rest of the team, with your residents, and you take the time to really nurture people, and that you're going to be a great match for her. And I'd go back the day before and say, hey, Marianne, don't forget, Allison's coming tomorrow. And then that day I would say, hey, Alice, or Marianne, thank you for what you did for Allison, right? I'm going to check in on Allison. How are things going, and so forth. What I've heard over and over again in focus groups from people is that when Allison just shows up and Marianne had no idea, people will say, they didn't even care enough to tell me. It takes time. It takes a lot of energy to train somebody. And then they just throw this person at me. I guess that could show how much they care about me. And that's the interpretation. And people go down this really bad spiral of not feeling valued, which is part of, by the way, the culture of the organization. So is money enough? It is not. It is not. Because I've seen great yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I haven't been able to, the chat box isn't showing up at my screen the way it is on yours, but I did see one question about ethnic group results. I will call out that we had only about 10% of respondents that were in ethnic minorities. So I did not do a deep dive there just because of the low sample size. So I don't think our sample was reflective of our probably employee mix from an ethnic background standpoint. So I just wanted to answer that question. All right, I'm going to jump into, we kind of shifted gears on the survey and asked about what are the things that the industry should most focus on to improve the sector. And because I'm very solutions oriented, I know Denise, you are too. That's what your business is based on. So let's look at. Hold on. Okay, here we go. All right, so as I said earlier, in terms of the key findings, community level improvements are deemed as most important. And I highlighted what I call the top box score, or the extremely important score. So retaining quality staff in the communities is viewed as the most important, probably pretty much by far, in terms of it being extremely important. Well, coincidentally, number 2, 3, and 4 are all things that can improve retention in the communities. Increasing focus on mentoring staff, increasing training, and improving senior leadership in the communities. And when I looked at if there are any differences in how these sort of play out by level or by tenure, very interesting to see that the C-suite also agreed that retaining quality staff in communities was most important, and they also were highest in terms of importance of increasing training. So the need is there, this majority community level folks or operations level folks saying these things are important. The C-suite agrees that it's important. So I think the key is how to turn that importance right into action. And the mentoring piece is super important there. And our mentorship level is pretty good. Across the board, we have a pretty high level of folks being mentored already. And so that's really great. And so that continues to need to be improved. And then we hope at Empower to develop a really robust mentor matching program that we're developing now, and we'll share more about it later. But those are really important pieces. Another thing I will say is that was interesting when I looked at tenure. In creating an improved image of the senior living sector and motivating people to seek careers in senior living, over-indexed amongst those who are in the industry for 5 years or less. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, one could speculate that it's because, they came in not really all that excited to work in senior living, and now they think it's great, or they're in and their peer group doesn't get what's so cool about it. One could speculate a lot of things there. So would love to have comments from anybody that's participating, or Denise or Allison. One of the questions also that was part of this sort of moving forward, drilling down, is on the training piece. The 2 positions that were deemed as most in need of training is the executive director at the community and nursing. Yep. So I think it was like 31% executive director, 28% nursing. So we asked, there were maybe 8 or 10 different sort of roles at a community, but those were the top 2. So when we prioritize training, whether it's at the organization level or what we're going to do with Empower, those are things that I think will definitely come into play. All right, so I'm going to shift over to you, Denise.
My favorite slide, I told you yesterday, you're going to see it again, because I think it's so perfect for this data that we're seeing today. And so when you look at some of the data that Mary Ann went over, when you think about some of what Allison shared, what might you be tolerating in your organization? What are you tolerating on your team? Maybe what even behavior, if you look hard in the mirror at yourself, might you be tolerating? And some of it you might not be aware of, but you are now. And so acting on it is going to be incredibly important, as Allison shared, advocating for people and encouraging that people are advocating for each other. I shared some of this data yesterday, but I want to,
Sorry.
Okay. Oh, you're controlling it. I'm like, wait, what's going on here? Can you
forward
one slide?
I'm sorry.
That's all right. No, can you forward it one slide?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So here's what people want. When we have measured culture in organizations and asked what's personally important to you, this is what people shared. Their personal values, what's important to them personally. Honesty, accountability, caring, commitment, respect, positive attitude, and so forth. You can see those things there. Think about this how it applies to the data that we just saw, right? We see accountability, right? Is there accountability when we are not behaving in the way that we should be? If someone's getting bullied, what's happening? And just like that last slide, if we're tolerating that behavior, it will continue and that becomes our new norm. If we do not tolerate it, if somebody speaks up, and it's probably not going to be that brand new employee, right? Nope, the way that she's going to speak up is, I'm going back to Burger King. Even though I put in all these hours of training to study to become a nursing assistant, I've been studying to take my exam, I'm going to go back to work at Burger King. So think about what's important to people personally and use this to really take advantage of some of this data and information that you have now. And we go to that next one, organizational, the current organization. And this is what people see in their current organization now. Teamwork, which is wonderful, but we also see accountability show up, right? Which is a good thing, but we see a much bigger call for it in the desired culture. We see things like bureaucracy and hierarchy show up. We see organizational growth. We talked about that through mentoring and coaching, the need for continuous improvement, right? These are the things that people see in their organizations now, but they also want more of these things in their organization. And finally, can we go to that last one, the desired culture? Look at what's number one there. By far, accountability is the number one value or behavior that we see people wanting in their organization. Accountability is not micromanaging. Someone mentioned that yesterday. It's not discipline, right? It's me being personally accountable. It's peers being accountable for each other, right? It's someone seeing that situation where someone said, I'm not orientating you. And for the supervisor that made that introduction to have that conversation, or a peer maybe to say, that's not how we treat people here. My dream is, we know that accountability is high up on the ladder, what people want. My dream is that we have thriving cultures in senior living where peer to peer we can have these conversations. Because you're gonna have people that just frankly are just jerks, right? But when they come into your culture and your culture does not support behaviors like someone acting like a jerk, they are going to be squeezed out of the organization, or they're going to be squeezed to kind of conform to the norms of your organization, which is, you know what? Teamwork, see, top teamwork, current culture values, is how we work around here. Respect is important to us. That behavior that just happened does not meet our cultural norms. And so we're going to see people, I've seen this time and time again, even in the organizations where I was a leader, as we started to raise the bar on accountability, as we started to raise the bar on what was acceptable, people changed, or those people that just couldn't change left the organization or were told to leave because they couldn't fit those norms. Small percentage, most people are getting the cues from people around them, their leaders, as well as their peers on how to act. And if that's acceptable, once again, that worst behavior that you're tolerating is going to continue to spread. I think of it like if you were a total metalhead and into Black Sabbath, and you show up at the opera, you are either going to sit down and listen to that opera, or you're going to be like, hell no, this is not the place for me, and get up and go. And that's what we need our organizations to be, places where the culture is, we support each other, we are a team, we are positive, we're not all negative, complaining and bullying each other and blaming each other. And so we'll go to that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can I just, I would love to hear both of your thoughts on if you see gender impact, right, on these current culture values and desired culture values, whether you see gender influencing or having more of a preponderance of some of these values versus others, depending on the gender of the leadership.
I have not, and probably because I have not studied that specifically. You know, I see the blame and bullying show up in organizations very often. In fact, in some organizations, it shows up on and this is why it's so important to do your own unique organization, because this is an average of every organization, but we have seen bullying and blame show up on the current culture values in the top 10. So when you have 10 words to choose to describe your organization, how it is right now, and bullying is one of those words, that's pretty scary to me. So, but it not connected it to, you know, is it male or female leadership in those places?
Okay, do you want me to jump?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Next slide, okay.
So this has been one of the most powerful tools to me personally, and that I think that we have shared with organizations. And this is out of MIT from like 20 years ago, the accountability ladder. And so you can see there at the bottom there, it's unaware or unconscious. And now you are no longer unaware that you're part of this presentation. You know, right? And so now that you know, we have to do better. And if you've gotten this information and you immediately went that one rung up and started saying, well, my boss or the owners or the shareholders or the board or whatever, my childhood, anything, all of this, right? We need to start moving up this ladder. And so I'm going to challenge you to say, get at least to right above there of that victim to accountable, to acknowledging the reality, right? You heard what you heard today. Start being aware. Are you seeing some of this in your organization? Are you maybe guilty of some of these things? Once again, sometimes we don't know what's happening. I just made a mistake before with something I said, right? It happens. And so acknowledge that reality. And how do we start moving up that ladder, embracing it and looking at solutions? I have people, we introduce this to them and they say, we're leaving this all over our conference room because it's, and I even personally use this. Sometimes we fall way below in this victim behavior and we need to pop up above that and get more to how do we become more accountable personally, changing things. So I think it's just a really powerful tool that we can use. Susan, you make a great point that it's hard to get new hires, that bad apples are kept on board. There's a fear of no good replacement. I would agree with that. That is the reason that sometimes people don't want to get rid of people or they're afraid of accountability. But every time in my experience, what has happened is when we start holding those people accountable, the rest of the group goes, well, thank God that's finally being dealt with. My guess is if your turnovers, and I know it's not you, but you know, an organization, if your turnover is not where you want it to be, and you're not dealing with people because you're afraid to lose people. I once had somebody say to me like, oh, I know that person's awful. You know, she's chased out 7 of the new staff members we hired, but we can't afford to lose her. What? Like, look at that math. We're keeping 1 person and she just chased out 7. Like, that's somebody I want to do a financial arrangement with because they obviously do not get math. I'm like, here's $1, please give me 7 back, right? So when we make these excuses, right, at the bottom of these these victim behaviors, that's a victim behavior, right? Oh, we can't afford to lose anybody. There'll be nobody. There's going to be nobody if you keep on letting the bullies spread and chase people out. Next slide. So you get me on my soapbox. And then just finally, I want to share with you modeling the way. So the leadership model that we use is the Leadership Challenge, which is based on 40 years of research on what makes exemplary leaders. And it breaks it down into 5 categories. One of those categories is modeling the way. People look to their leaders to model the way. And so you have to take a hard look in the mirror. Am I setting a personal example? So if I'm seeing something not happen, if I'm seeing something happen that's not right, am I dealing with it right then? We worked with an organization, we'd showed that accountability ladder to them. And afterwards, the CEO said to me, you know, there's something that happened in a meeting last week and I should have said something I didn't. People love to come into this meeting and like throw grenades. He called it throwing grenades at each other in this meeting. And he said, and I should have dealt with it right then and there, and said, that's not what we do to each other in here. If you have something to talk about, you talk with that person, but it's not, to embarrass the person in front of me as the CEO or the rest of the leadership team is not acceptable behavior. And so I just want to challenge you really to think about that, right? Are you setting that personal example of what you expect of others? Because modeling the way is a huge part of being an exemplary leader, which I know you all want to be, and what we need so desperately in our field right now. All right, I think that's it for my slides.
Okay, now I have a question, and Denise, like I said, I know you've been sort of looking at the question, so if there's anything that jumps out at you, but I wanted to ask Allison a question, because again, I'm very much into the whys behind the whats, and I think many of us have heard about this idea of the imposter syndrome. Has everybody heard of that, right? How does that play out in the workplace, and is that more prevalent amongst women than men, or vice versa?
Yeah, generally more prevalent among women. And it actually ties back very closely to that idea of that stereotype conflict, this idea of like, I might feel this way inside, but the world expects me to be in a different way outside. And that's really what creates that kind of feeling. So yeah, everyone feels that way from time to time. And so we're only talking about averages, but yeah, we see that that's something that women experience.
Right. And I think that ties into what you said in one of your slides about sort of that, sense of sort of credibility and respect, right? If you come in feeling sort of imposter syndrome, it's going to impact your behaviors and, bullying or being bullied, right?
Yeah, I mean, it impacts it generally negatively. One of two things happen, right? You don't speak up at all because you feel like as soon as you speak, you will be declared a fraud. That's a problem. Or you try to account for it by saying, okay, I'm going to prove that I'm in charge, and that's where some of that more hostile and uncivil behavior actually.
Yeah. One of the other comments that I saw when I opened up the chat was somebody said women need to advocate for other women. I want to call out that that's actually, that idea was the genesis of Empower. Steve and I had this conversation last summer, and we were talking about the hashtag #MeToo movement, which of course is really prevalent and very, very important. But I said, I think that there's really a lot of emphasis that's lacking on women supporting other women in the workplace, and that we are in a unique position to help each other and support each other, help each other to achieve our career goals, give us that sense of confidence and security and respect, so people can kind of bring their best selves to the workplace. So just I want to shout out whoever wrote that. That's spot on. That is kind of the premise of everything that we're doing.
Marianne, can I just go back to a comment that was written a little while ago? I don't know your first name, but SM Ross, who wrote this and wrote as the panelist. So I'm going to read it because I think it's, once again, this awareness piece and for us to be aware. And I don't want this to go. I'm a female resident in a large ALR in DC in which any resident suggestions or input, however serious and professional, are discouraged. In fact, all of us are treated like incompetent children who need to be told what to do. Part of the problem is in my facility includes dementia residents among the general population. So I believe that has caused part of the problem. Combining different populations does not work. There's too little staff to address the needs of both groups. So everyone dumbs everything down, including policy procedures. During COVID, it means all residents are treated as having dementia and now restricted to their rooms 24 hours a day with no visitors allowed and minimal interaction with staff. We've been restricted to one assisted phone call a week. There's much increased depression and deterioration among us. We're treated as the problem here rather than the employees who are, in fact, not complying with the rules and are bringing COVID into the facility. I just, and Allison, I know our field isn't your expertise, but I would just think that when I think from that comment, would it be the same? Let's advocate for, as team members, let's advocate for residents, let's advocate for each other, that we're all advocating for you. Yes, Kendall, it makes me upset too to hear that. So any comments from either one of you? I just didn't want to let that comment go because I think it's an important one and another advocacy example.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it's always harder to be an advocate for yourself than for somebody else. And so if I always counsel people on one thing, it is speak up for the people who need to be spoken for. And if we do that, then others will turn around and do it for us. And so I think I would love a world where no one had to self-promote or self-advocate because other people were always doing it, getting ahead of them, right? And doing it first.
Yeah.
And I think that is really important.
Yeah. So we all have the opportunity to do that for team members here that are on this, leaders, to speak up when we see something maybe from the resident side that doesn't seem right, and the residents that are on this, and I know there are a number, to do that for each other as well.
Denise, in terms of hiring folks who kind of share the values that you had in your slide, any sort of tricks of the trade you can share quickly about, how you screen people for the values that you're looking for, or behaviors that are inconsistent with your culture?
Yeah, so I think most often what I see people doing is using behavioral-based, value-based questions for examples. for people to share with them examples of when they've done something with a certain value that they're looking for. I also know there's organizations that will bring people in and have them do very quick paperwork and then work for a little bit to see their interactions with residents and team members. I love the idea. I see people bringing residents in to do the interviews, which tells you right from the very start who's in charge and who should be in charge, right? Sometimes organizations have a resident greet the person and then talk to them for a little bit before they go interview with somebody else and then get that resident's input. I think it's a little bit after the hiring process, but one of the greatest things too I've seen in an organization in Connecticut, the residents were the one that decided when somebody was done with their I hate the probationary period words, but they were ready, you know, when they had met all their, that they could do all the services and competencies and so forth. And I thought, what better person to say, yes, this person's good at this and what they're doing than the person on the receiving end of that service, which I thought was really cool. So hopefully some of those are helpful to you.
That's great. Well, hopefully, I think Steve's telling us it's time to wrap up. Hopefully you all found this information to be helpful, you know, interesting, and, you know, there's that saying, you can't change something until you acknowledge it. So, you know, we kind of threw a lot of data out there. This is our reality. I think that this is, you know, at the response level that we got, I think we can't ignore some of these findings, and I hope that everyone will consider taking these insights and putting them into use for your future planning.